At 33,000 feet above Athens, a passenger jet was silently circling in the sky. More than 2 hours had passed, yet the aircraft had completely lost contact with air traffic control. Controllers called again and again, but there was no response, only silence. As concern turned into alarm, a terrifying question began to emerge. Had the aircraft been hijacked? With no time to lose, the Greek Air Force scrambled 2 F-16 fighter jets to intercept the plane. When the fighter pilots finally pulled alongside the aircraft and looked inside, what they saw was horrifying. The captain's seat was empty. The first officer was slumped over the controls, unconscious, and throughout the cabin, passengers appeared motionless. No distress calls, no signs of a struggle, just an aircraft full of people drifting silently through the sky. Something had gone terribly wrong. A flight that departed like any other, but within hours became a silent flying graveyard. Today on Sky Stories, we're uncovering the chilling true story of Helios Airways Flight 522. The ghost flight that claimed 121 lives and became one of the most haunting tragedies in aviation history. On the night of August 13, 2005, a Boeing 737 took off from London's Heathrow Airport. The flight, known as Olympia, was heading to Larnaca International Airport in Cyprus. The aircraft was operated by Helios Airways, a low-cost Cypriot airline that connected several destinations across Europe. At first, everything seemed completely normal. But shortly after takeoff, the flight crew noticed an unusual noise coming from near one of the aircraft doors. Upon inspection, they discovered a layer of ice forming around the door seal. The issue was recorded in the aircraft's technical logbook so that engineers could investigate it after landing. Later that night, the aircraft arrived safely in Larnaca. The captain reported the problem to ground engineer Alan Irwin and requested an inspection of the cabin pressurization system. This system is critical, as it maintains a safe and breathable environment for passengers at high altitude. To perform the inspection, the engineer switched the pressurization control from auto to manual mode, a routine procedure during maintenance checks. After a thorough inspection, no faults were found. Everything appeared to be working perfectly. But during the process, a critical mistake was made. When the inspection was complete, the pressurization control was never switched back to auto. No one noticed. No warning was raised. And no one realized that a disaster had already begun to unfold. Just a few hours later, the same aircraft was preparing for another flight. Everything appeared normal. But hidden behind the cockpit panels, a single overlooked setting was quietly waiting to trigger one of the deadliest accidents in aviation history. Now let's move to the day when everything was about to change, August 14, 2005. For most people, it was just another ordinary morning. At 9:07 a.m. local time, Helios Airways Flight 522 was cleared for departure from Larnaca, Cyprus. The Boeing 737 was scheduled to fly to Athens before continuing onward to Prague. Inside the cockpit were 2 experienced pilots, 59-year-old Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten and 51-year-old First Officer Pampos Charalambous. Together, they had accumulated more than 23,000 hours of flight experience. On board were 115 passengers, including families and young children. They were accompanied by 4 cabin crew members, all preparing for what should have been a routine flight. To everyone on board, it seemed like a normal day, a normal flight, a normal journey. But hidden beneath the surface was a chain of events that would soon turn this ordinary morning into a nightmare. As the crew completed their final preparations and the passengers settled into their seats, no one noticed that a critical error from the previous night had gone undetected. An error so small that it appeared insignificant, yet powerful enough to seal the fate of everyone on board. Among the cabin crew that morning was Andreas Prodromou. Like everyone else, he expected nothing more than another routine flight. He had no idea that within a few hours, he would find himself at the center of one of aviation's most haunting tragedies. As Flight 522 taxied toward the runway, everything appeared perfectly normal. But the countdown to disaster had already begun, the like. Little did they know that this seemingly ordinary decision would become the biggest turning point of their lives a few hours later. As passengers began boarding the aircraft, both pilots were busy completing the pre-flight checklist in the cockpit. Before every flight, this checklist is a critical safety procedure, requiring pilots to carefully inspect every switch, every system, and every instrument to ensure the aircraft is ready for departure. But that morning, the flight was already running behind schedule. Pressed for time, the crew worked through the checklist more quickly than usual. And in that rush, a fatal mistake went unnoticed. Neither pilot noticed that the cabin pressurization mode selector was still set to manual. It should have been set to auto. At first glance, it seemed like a minor oversight. But in reality, that single switch would soon determine the fate of everyone on board. At 9:07 a.m., Flight 522 finally departed from Larnaca Airport. The first few minutes of the flight were completely normal. The weather was clear, and the aircraft continued climbing steadily toward its assigned altitude. Just minutes after takeoff, air traffic control cleared the flight to climb to its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. But by then, an invisible danger had already begun to unfold. As the aircraft climbed higher and higher, the cabin was no longer being properly pressurized. With each passing minute, the air inside the aircraft became thinner, and the amount of oxygen available to everyone on board continued to decrease. No one realized that the very air around them was slowly turning against them. Then, only a few minutes after takeoff, a warning alarm suddenly sounded inside the cockpit. It was the cabin altitude warning, an alarm specifically designed to alert pilots that oxygen levels inside the cabin had fallen to a dangerously low level. But astonishingly, the pilots failed to recognize what the warning actually meant. Value us. The time was slipping away. Confusion began to spread inside the cockpit. Meanwhile, passengers started experiencing unusual symptoms as the aircraft continued its climb. The cabin crew tried to keep everyone calm, but with every passing minute, the situation was becoming more serious. Then suddenly, Flight 522 lost contact with air traffic control. Controllers called again, and again, and again, but there was no response. Only silence. This was no longer an ordinary flight. It had become a mystery unfolding at 34,000 feet above the Mediterranean Sea. Little did they know that the aircraft was scheduled to land at Athens Airport at 10:45 a.m., but by 9:23 a.m., Flight 522 had already reached its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. At 9:37 a.m., it entered Greek airspace. Air traffic controllers repeatedly called the aircraft, but no one answered. Inside the cockpit, both pilots had likely become incapacitated by hypoxia, a condition caused by dangerously low oxygen levels. As the aircraft continued flying on autopilot, the crew and passengers were slowly losing consciousness. By 10:45 a.m., the exact time the flight should have landed in Athens, the aircraft was still circling in the sky. Controllers continued making radio calls. Nearby aircraft also tried to establish contact, but every attempt was met with silence. At first, authorities suspected a communication failure. However, when the aircraft suddenly entered a holding pattern instead of landing, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Greek authorities immediately ordered 2 F-16 fighter jets to intercept the aircraft. When the fighter pilots approached Flight 522, they witnessed a disturbing scene. The first officer appeared unconscious. The captain showed no signs of activity, and inside the passenger cabin, there was almost no visible movement. The aircraft seemed to be flying completely on its own. Then, at approximately 11:49 a.m., the fighter pilots noticed a man entering the cockpit. Moments later, he sat in the captain's seat and appeared to be attempting to regain control of the aircraft. Investigators would later identify him as Andreas Prodromou, a flight attendant who also held a commercial pilot's license. Despite having no training on the Boeing 737, Andreas desperately tried to save the aircraft. He transmitted emergency calls and attempted to control the situation. But time was running out. At 11:50 a.m., the aircraft's left engine failed due to fuel exhaustion. Shortly afterward, the second engine also lost power. Flight 522 began descending rapidly. The fighter pilots watched helplessly as the aircraft lost altitude. Then, at approximately 12:04 p.m., the Boeing 737 crashed into the hills near Grammatico, northeast of Athens. All 121 people on board lost their lives. The tragedy shocked the world. Investigators later discovered that the aircraft's pressurization system had been left in manual mode after maintenance. As the plane climbed, the cabin failed to pressurize properly. Oxygen levels gradually dropped, causing the pilots, crew, and passengers to become incapacitated. A warning alarm had sounded in the cockpit, but the pilots misinterpreted its meaning and failed to recognize the danger. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late. The final report concluded that a combination of maintenance errors and human mistakes led to the disaster. A chain of small oversights ultimately resulted in the loss of 121 lives. Today, a memorial near the crash site honors the victims of Helios Airways Flight 522. Their story remains one of the most haunting reminders in aviation history, that sometimes a single overlooked detail can lead to unimaginable consequences.